Okay. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Quarantine Book Club hosted by the Jewish Women's Archive and JewishLIVE. I'm Judith Rosenbaum. I'm the CEO of the Jewish Women's Archive, and I am so glad to be here with all of you tonight. JWA, for those of you who don't know us, is a digital archive devoted to expanding the Jewish narrative. We document Jewish women's stories and elevate their voices, and our goal is to inspire all people to see themselves as history makers. I hope that you will check out the great diversity of our resources at JWA.org to see how we explore the past as a framework for understanding the issues that matter to us today. We are also book lovers, and we have an online book club which offers both book suggestions and original content from authors, and the Quarantine Book Club draws on these resources. You can sign up for updates from our site, and you can also follow our book club on Goodreads. Lex?
Yeah, thank you so much to everybody for coming. This is a really awesome occasion. Just to name it out loud for those watching in the future. Yeah, because there's people watching afterwards and now. We've got over 190 people, 199 and counting in this call, and it's a really incredible thing, I think, to be able to gather like this virtually, digitally, when we can't in other ways. So thank you all for coming. Yeah, JewishLIVE is really thrilled to be partnering with the Jewish Women's Archive on this, and you can follow our various channels. Our Facebook page is available just at JewishLIVE, all one word, and that just keeps you informed about upcoming events like this one, where you can stay Jewishly engaged in this time of social distancing. And you can also follow JewishLIVE.org, where we are live streaming this as we speak, and where we're featuring many other live stream events over the coming days, weeks, and beyond. So thank you so much. And back to Judith.
Thank you, Lex. It's great to see the numbers of participants going up. I am just so delighted to welcome all of you to this conversation tonight. For those of you who were here last week, I was really moved by the experience of connecting and being in conversation with so many people around the world at our last meeting. And I know that we continue to need these opportunities for connection and art and conversation more than ever. So we're really glad to be able to provide this opportunity. Again, we are expecting a large crowd. We have a large crowd already. So unfortunately, we can't have video and audio enabled for all of the participants. And really, unfortunately, we have the chat disabled right now so that we could get rid of some trolls. But we will turn the chat back on in a little bit when we're ready to take your questions. We're really excited to engage you in the conversation. And for those of you who don't know where the chat is, you'll be able to look at the bottom of your screen. If you mouse down there, you'll see a little thing that says chat. And if you pop that up, you can add your question, and then you can close it again if you don't want to see things continuing to scroll. So once we start that part of our program, you should feel free to add questions. Tonight, we are really lucky to be joined by Rachel Barenbaum. Rachel's debut novel is A Bend in the Stars. I have my copy right here. It has been named a New York Times Summer Reading Selection and a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writer Selection. It's also a Boston Globe bestseller. Rachel is hard at work on her second novel, The History of Time Travel, which should be coming out in 2021. Rachel is a graduate of Grub Street's Novel Incubator. In a former life, she was a hedge fund manager and a spin instructor. She has degrees from Harvard in business and in literature and philosophy, and she now lives in Brookline with her husband and 3 kids and a dog named Zusha, after the folk hero who inspires many tales around their dinner table. So welcome, Rachel. We're so glad to have you with us tonight.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here, and I just love seeing all of you guys, jumping into this meeting. It's amazing. These numbers just keep climbing. So thank you.
And I'm just going to hide non-video participants. Okay. So A Bend in the Stars, I really enjoyed rereading it this week. And it's such a great read for this moment because it's an epic tale. It's very engrossing. And it's really about a race across Russia in 1914. Can you tell us a little bit about the story, first of all, and how you came to discover this and pursue it?
Yeah, sure. So I guess the one sentence description that I always give to people is that is the story of a Jewish scientist racing Einstein to prove relativity. And along the way, he goes missing. His sister goes after him, and she is one of Russia's first female surgeons. So she is the hero. She saves the day. She's a feminist, and she really at the end is the one that saves the book, and she's the heart. So that's what the book is about in a nutshell. And then the next question, right, of course, is how did I get this idea? So should we go to some of our visuals?
Yeah.
We'll move into that. All right. So let's see if I can screen share with everyone on here. And all right, are we up?
I think so. I can see it.
All right. So in 2014, I was reading this Scientific American, and it said 100 years ago this month, Einstein was just on the verge of proving relativity. He had equations, he had the theory, but he didn't have his physical evidence, which would be a picture at a total solar eclipse. And from that picture, he could measure the amount that light was bent by gravity. So in 1914, he was so close, and he put together an expedition. He raised money because there was a solar eclipse that was due over Russia. And so he was going to send a team up there to take this picture for him. Only World War I broke out. So his team never made it. They were stopped at the border, and no one took a picture of that total solar eclipse to prove total relativity in 1914. So even before I put this magazine down, I just thought to myself, that's a book. Right? That's a book. I mean, someone else was working on this. Einstein was not working in a vacuum. What if somebody beat him? And what if that somebody was Vanya, my scientist, right? So I started making up the characters and really pushing through that storyline. So this is where I got the idea.
Wow. And so once you had the idea, what was the process like to go from the story idea to having the right information and being able to put together such a detailed, beautiful, complicated story?
Yeah. So I get this question a lot, and I love to talk about the research that went into this book because, it's one thing to say, wouldn't this be great if I have somebody racing Einstein? But then to make that a believable story and to really put that together takes a lot of work, both to understand what was happening in 1914 Russia and also about physics and relativity. And luckily, I think of 1914 as it's this beautiful moment where ideas are just exploding. And I guess we can talk about that a little bit later to give you some context of what was going on. But in particular, everyone was fascinated with Russia, and National Geographic put out this 1914 issue, right before war was breaking out. They took all of the pictures and put this together. And it says here, 16 pages of 4-color work. Photos. And this is just an amazing trove of photographs because I really had to understand what it looked like, what this world looked like in order for me to build the scene. Because, for example, you can see from the cover that there are a lot of scenes that happen on a train. And you can read about the specs of a train, and you can see, read all about in history books what trains looked like in 1914. But unless you can see pictures, you don't understand if somebody gets into a fight on a train, what they're going to hit, what are they going to knock into, what's going to be in the train with them. So these sorts of pictures were just unbelievable resources for me. And also YIVO, which is an online encyclopedia, is a huge source of photos. So should I go in and show you some of the pictures now?
Show us some of the pictures.
Yeah, so this is some of my favorite stuff. I mean, I loved looking into this. And so let's see. Here's one of the first pictures that I really started exploring when I started looking into the eclipse. These are pictures actually taken from an expedition that was set up to photograph the solar eclipse at that time. So look at that. So there were other expeditions in Russia, and this is the equipment. And so in the book, I write about how it took them months to build this equipment and set everything up. And this really gives you the sense of why, like the scale. And it looks a little bit like an amusement park at first, but
it really does.
I know it's crazy, but this is what it would look like, and what I put in there. And
so it gives you a sense that racing across the country would not have been fast because you'd be schlepping a lot of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Especially if you're mounting an expedition, and that you need a lot of money and that you need a lot of help. It can't just be a single person, right? To run all this machinery, to build all of this. And also, when you think about relativity, I mean, it seems like such an advance, and it seems so sort of highfalutin. I don't know. And you look at this and it seems so, it's not like, you're looking at, it doesn't look like high technology. And yet at the time, this was high technology. So it really helped me sort of bring that back. But then, so what did Russia look like itself? So my characters, of course, are racing across Russia in order to get to the right space where they can actually photograph this eclipse, where they can see it. And I actually grew up with family who escaped from Russia, from pogroms and anti-Semitism. And they told me when I was growing up, right, Russia was a bad word. We didn't speak Russian. We didn't speak Yiddish. We were Americans. And they really portrayed their experience in Russia as this. This is not my family, but from what everybody said, all of my relatives that came from Russia, this is what life was like. And I used these kind of photographs when I wrote the book because I really wanted to get to this, to understand, like, what did the clothing actually look like? Not just, I mean, you could look at pictures online and see perfect, beautiful pieces, but look at what the kids are wearing, right? Look at the shoes. Are there socks there? You can see the holes. You can see the ragged hems. You can really dig into what it was like, and can see, I think it was brutal. Let's see. So I looked, some of my other favorite pictures. Oh yes, and I already saw this picture. I saw this question in the chat earlier while it was enabled. One of the people who came on early said, did I travel to Russia to do research? And the answer is that I did not. And hopefully this picture shows you why it would not have helped. So this is actually a picture of, on the bottom, you see modern day current Russia. And then the top, you see the exact same street, the exact same place. And look at how different that is. Look at how there are people sitting there on the tracks, sorting the bricks, right? The cobblestones to actually make the roads. And look at the horses next to, juxtaposed to the trolleys, to the people, to the carriages. I mean, this just blew my mind, right? I mean, can you believe, look at the difference.
And the bottom, there's so much, there's like tourist, it's like clearly a tourist scene.
Yes, it's a clean tourist, beautiful scene. I mean, there's even a blue sky, right? And above, it's just gray and hard. And on this next screen, you can also see this juxtaposition. I have a scene where Miri, my main character, the surgeon, runs. She escapes down to the side of the riverbank. And this is what I imagined. I used this picture to really help me imagine what she was running down, what kind of path she went down. But so in the top in black and white, that's what she would have seen in 1914. But if I traveled to Russia to actually look at it, or to modern day Kaunas, this is what I would see in the bottom. And it's just, I mean, it's mind boggling how much that has changed.
Yeah, so that scene would not have worked in that bottom picture.
Yeah, no way. So, this kind of research I thought was much more helpful. And I know there are lots of novelists for whom traveling to the location is extremely helpful, but I think that's because the change maybe is not quite as radical as these pictures will show you. So let's see. Here, I have actually, I don't know if any of you have your books, your copies of Ben and the Stars with you, but on page 86, I actually have, this is the picture that inspired that. This is in Kovno.
Do you want to read a little bit from that scene?
Yeah, sure. So let's see. So this is where I looked at this, and this is a picture of Kovno, and this is what I wrote. It was, Miri hurried. Without the sun, the air was tinged with the smell of damp, and the limestone buildings that framed the road looked darker than they should. As she descended into the slums, streetlights cast shadows that magnified the laddered appearance of the tiled rooftops. She tucked Tamara's hat into her bag and tried to think about how she'd break the news to Anatoly's mother. She thought she was following Tamara's careful directions, but she didn't know this section of the city, and in 4 turns, she was lost. She tried to retrace her steps, but when she came out at the river, and this was, you saw the picture before of that riverside where she came out, which was underneath this bridge. She knew she was even farther from where she wanted to be, deep in the city's underbelly of mills and factories. She looked around, tried to plan her route home. The triangular roof on the tower of Kovno Castle loomed in the distance. The bulk of the train station rose nearby, and the great bridge hung overhead. So there you go. You can sort of see how these pictures helped me figure out what I was going to write. And then here's another one of my favorites. So Judith, we talked about this before. So this picture, I don't really know what these people are doing or where they're coming from, but I look at this, and this is so important for me for writing this book, because look at their feet. Look at the shape of the shoes, and look at the mud. Look how it's caked on their legs. It's on their aprons, right? And you have this child carrying a heavy weight on his head. I mean,
and he's not even wearing shoes, I don't think.
Yeah, it doesn't look like it. And what are they walking on? What are they stepping on? And then you see these beautiful grand buildings in the background, and think of all the money that it took to build those. And then these people in the forefront. So here we have another example of a picture of a street scene that any one of my characters might have walked by. And you'll see there's Hebrew lettering, and there are many different languages, I think, that are around. But also look at the streets, look at how muddy they are, and the trees, right? I mean, it was just that dirt, those layers of dirts I don't get a sense of when I read about the history, or, how these buildings were constructed of these stones. And here we have a picture of an actual matchmaker. So one of my main characters is the grandmother. She's a babushka. And this guy in the black hat, who's in the center of the picture, he's an actual matchmaker in Kovno. And he is trying to make a pair there. And again, you can look, there's sort of rough hewn, barrel and the boxes. You see the guy in the back sort of, maybe looking sketchy, but not so used to what's going on. And here we have Riga. This is another picture that I used I used for my research. So look at the trolley tracks, and then look at the lines above. All those lines, I talk a lot in the book about how those electric lines, sort of they're like a web holding the city in, but also that it's this gorgeous expanse in the back. Okay, so the next two, so I talk about, so Miri is a surgeon, and she is engaged to marry Yuri, another surgeon. And hospitals at the time were split into two sections. So should I read this explaining?
Yeah, sure.
What that is? Okay. So let's see, on page 309 to 310, if any of you have your book, you can read along with me. It says, Miri met Anya in the lobby and followed her on a tour of the hospital. It was divided into distinct sections. The third floor was a converted attic where sleeping quarters were carved into the rafters. The second floor was for patrons and paying clients, separated by a marble lobby. The men's and women's wards were gilded and frescoed, lit by chandeliers. The women read books and sewed. The men smoked cigarettes. Without the men wearing uniforms, Miri couldn't tell who was an officer, but Anya confided there were several. Since the hospital was known as the best in Kiev, even non-Jews came. And so Miri kept her head tucked low and didn't say a word. Any one of them could have been someone who would recognize Sasha or even Miri. The first floor was for those who couldn't afford to pay. The men's and women's wings were gray and loud. Cots were shoehorned into every corner. Patients played cards and groaned and gambled. Children slept under their mothers' beds. It felt like Kovno's free clinic. So there you get the idea I wrote about, that there are two sets of hospitals, basically, even in the Jewish hospital. So you have the rich, fancy section. In this picture I'm showing you here, you see the rich hospital. And look at how plump everyone is, and smiley and clean. And it's just a beautiful, happy picture. And then this is the poor hospital. This is, look at it's heartbreaking. If I don't smile about this, I will start crying, because you just look at these faces, they're gaunt. I don't know what happened to all these children, why they're all covered this way, but this gives you the true sense of the difference, right? Here we have the rich, shiny, smiling hospital. And then this is where Miri would have worked. She would have spent some time in the rich one, but really this is where most of the book is centered. And so again, these kinds of pictures, look at the walls, look at the doors, look at just look at the difference that what they're surrounded by. And in this picture, you see these beautiful, I don't know, depictions of anatomy and, a baby in the womb in the background. And here it's just stains and despair and heartbreaking. So those are some of my main research pictures that I had pulled out to show you guys.
Yeah, it gives you a sense of sort of where the details come from. I always think about that when I read just and particularly with historical fiction, just having a sense of the time period and what the sights and smells and sounds and feel of it is. And I think the photos really do give you a sense of how you could come up with that richness. One of the things that I was really struck by, you have a kind of framing piece to the novel so that it starts in the present, more or less, with a granddaughter. Is it a granddaughter? Mm-hmm. Who is getting into the story through a museum exhibition that's being put up. And Ethel says, history needs a narrator. Perhaps this museum chose the wrong one. And I love that, because one of the things that we often think about in our work at JWA is how much the story changes depending on who is telling the story. And our work is often putting women's stories at the center of the story and thinking about how that just shifts our whole understanding of the world when we foreground those stories. So you've certainly foregrounded the stories of women, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you chose who would be your narrator and how that shaped the story that you told.
Sure. Should I take these pictures down?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So how did I choose my narrator? So for me, I love to read books with strong female protagonists, strong women who are pushing boundaries, who are going beyond maybe what they're expected or, supposed to be doing. And so, of course, that's also the kind of book that I love to write, because that's the story I want to read. And so when I sat down to write this, I thought, I was going to have a scientist racing Einstein. And my first inclination was to make that scientist a woman. And unfortunately, early readers who, were looking at those drafts just didn't believe it. They didn't buy it, that was just pushing too far. But I didn't want to abandon the story, because I thought this is such a great story and it's based in truth and science. And I didn't want to leave that. So I thought, well, who's going to be my main character then? How do I make this strong woman lead this book? And what were women doing? And I found there were actually 2 or 3 women who were practicing as surgeons in Russia at the time. And they were sort of funneled up from midwives. And they hadn't been schooled or educated in Russia. They had gone to medical schools in France and Switzerland and come back to Russia. But I thought, you know what, this is enough. I can make her a surgeon. And that's still pushing the boundary. Right? And she's not married yet, which also pushes the boundary. So you can only go so far. And my editor and I, we just went back and forth a lot. She would say, are you sure this isn't pushing too far? I don't know if I believe this. And I would say, no, I want her to do that. Right. So that was sort of a constant struggle as I went back through the book.
I think that there's an interesting thing about historical fiction. And we heard this a little bit last week also from Rachel Kadish in The Weight of Ink, that part of what historical fiction can do is fill in some of the stories that are missing from history. And it's always that delicate thing of wanting to find something that's believable, that could have been true. Even if the story of Miri isn't actually true, you knew that it was possible that there had been some female surgeons and you could pull some of those details in, but also fill in the imagination, the stories that just we've lost over time, and kind of give us back that piece of history that's been lost.
That's why I love this story about Einstein and relativity, because I think it's easy for a lot of us to say, oh, Einstein was brilliant, right? And you don't think of Einstein as, failing and fumbling and having the wrong math. But actually in 1914, his math was not correct. It was not accurate enough. And so there were a number of other scientists working on it. So that part of the story could also be true. And I love that because, I love telling kids in particular, like, you don't have, if you're brilliant, you take it out there, you try, you fail, you get up and you keep trying. And that's what Einstein did, right? He wasn't just brilliant the day he was born and came up with relativity.
Right.
And I love that.
Right. obviously one of the big themes of the book is time, speaking of relativity. And I'm guessing from the name of the book you're working on now that time is a big thing for you.
Yes.
And it's something that definitely has been something I've been thinking about. I think probably for many of us in this very strange pandemic time feels totally thrown out of whack, right? Like when so much is uncertain, every day feels like a year and every
Long.
week feels like months.
Yes.
And your book is very much about time and the tricks that time plays.
Yes.
And one of the things that you write about is just that sense that time isn't really linear. It doesn't travel in a straight line. And sort of there was this line that I love that I wrote down: knowing the end doesn't mean you can follow it back to the beginning. And in some ways, that's what you're saying about Einstein, right? That knowing that he becomes what we think of as Einstein, the like ultimate genius, doesn't mean that, we might read that back into his history, but actually you didn't know, that wasn't obvious. So
Right.
tell us a little bit about how you thought about time in this book and what intrigued you about this notion of time and relativity and how you thought about it.
Yeah, what is time? I mean, I've been obsessed with that question since I showed up for my first philosophy class at Harvard. And I sat there in front of this amazing professor. She was, I think she was like one of the few women who was on the tenure track in the department. And so I was so excited to sit there. And she says, "What is time?" And I was like, oh my God, that's what she's asking, because I thought I knew. And then, she said, well, actually minutes, hours, seconds, they're all invented. They're a convention that we agree on. Sequence is real, right? You have to crack an egg, right, in order to get the yolk out, and but that has to happen in sequence. But time itself, what is a minute? The definition of a minute is invented, and I've always been obsessed with that. And Einstein himself actually started thinking about time because he was famously working in the patent examiner's office, working on machines to synchronize clocks. Because back in the early 1900s, first time, we needed schedules, right? To run a train, you need a schedule. And so how do you agree what time it is in different countries and across large spaces? And so I've just always been fascinated with that. And in fact, I refer to at least 3 different calendars in the book. I've got the Jewish calendar, I have the Russian calendar at the time, and the American calendar, which all track time differently. For example, the Jewish calendar runs from sundown, right, to sundown, not midnight to midnight. And then you also have counting lunar, right, calendars, months. There are just all different ways to track time. And what does that mean? And I don't have an answer for it, but I do love to think about it.
And you bring in the Jewish calendar throughout the book as well.
Yeah. So I actually, I love to read this because I start each section with a little bit of sort of with the month, the Jewish month. That's how I divide it, because again, I'm trying to really focus or point out that there are different ways of tracking time. And I explain, the book starts in Tammuz, and it says, the Hebrew calendar is based on 3 astronomical phenomena: the rotation of the earth on its axis, the revolution of the moon around the earth, and the movement of the earth around the sun. Because I don't think we think of time that way. We think of it as a clock, as seconds. But hopefully by putting that in the front of the book, we're all sort of shifting that notion and asking what it means.
So I want to let our participants here know that I have reopened the chat so people can put their questions in. And actually, Lex just bounced us a question from Facebook, which is whether you had read about Einstein's first wife and the theory that relativity was actually her idea.
So Mileva was certainly a brilliant woman. And there are lots of people who have asked, is Einstein the one who should have all the credit? And there's no clear answer. There's also another mathematician who may have published the correct equations for relativity a week or 2 weeks, I don't remember the exact, before Einstein came and presented them. So, depending on who you talk to, maybe this other scientist, actually mathematician, beat both Einsteins if they were working together, or what the answer is. And again, this is why I really wanted to talk about the race to prove relativity, because it wasn't just Einstein. There's so many people working on it, and he had help. He wasn't really a mathematician. I mean, he was obviously brilliant, but he was more of a theorist. And that idea, I think, is pretty conclusively goes back to Einstein, the idea, the theory. But in terms of who was able to turn that into math and translate that so that everybody else could look at it and understand it and prove it. I mean, that's question. We don't know.
Right. I mean, also just looking at that picture of all the equipment, obviously there were teams of people working on this. And I think we're coming to understand now, certainly many times in terms of gender, but I'm sure not only, that often the person who got credit for the whole team, and we know this happens in labs today too, isn't the person necessarily who's generating all of the ideas, right?
Yeah.
So the people who were traveling around with these teams of people trying to document stuff weren't only schleppers. Presumably they also understood what was going on and had something to offer.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. To operate that equipment, you had to understand what it was doing, and you had to understand what your readings meant. So you weren't just, I don't know, a carpenter who didn't understand what you were building. You were someone who understood, why it had to be calibrated in a certain way and what you expected to find and not find. So there were a lot of people working on this, and the more research I did, the more I found.
So we're starting to get lots of great questions. Someone did ask just a logistical question about the view, speaker view versus gallery view. We don't have video for all the participants, so you'll just see me and Rachel. But if you click at the top, you can see speaker view or gallery view, and it'll switch whether you click on speaker view or gallery view in the upper right corner. So lots of questions about how, what your background was in terms of, how you came to the science piece, and did the kind of research that you did in this book lead you to kind of think about your own family history different? Those are a couple of them.
Yeah.
Some questions about time too.
So I guess the question is, did this research, make me think about my own family history differently?
Yeah, that's one of the questions. Start there.
Yeah. Not really. I mean, I knew that it was, but my great aunts in particular, every Friday night would remind me how terrible Russia was and ask me, I think some of you have heard the story before, right? Ask me if I knew where my passport was and emergency money so that I would be ready to run. And so I had grown up thinking that it was a terrible place and they left for a reason. And after this research, I understood why they left Russia and would never want to go back. So, Judith, should I show the picture of Einstein in the patent office?
Yeah.
Because I just love this picture. Here we go. Because we were talking about other people, right, working on this. And you see in this picture, so this is taken, I don't know, sometime in the early 1900s. This is the patent examiner's office when Einstein is trying to examine machines that are synchronizing clocks. And here he is in the back. Right, and we think of him as this sort of astute scientist, right? Judith, you had that great, explanation of who he was or description. And here he is. He's not the center. And look at all these other people working on these machines and thinking about this with him. And I just love that picture. So I wanted to share that. All right.
Yeah.
Next
right,
question.
Exactly. He's not always in the front. So a bunch of questions about how you came up with your characters and how you balance the relationship between characters and the kind of research piece and then the pieces that you were developing yourself in terms of characters and scenes. And did you have to, how did you get to the place where the book ended up? Was there a lot that you had to leave behind as you were trying to strike that balance?
Was there a lot I had to leave behind? Yes. I got hundreds of pages and many different stories because for me as a writer, I have to really write to get to know my characters and their backgrounds. But in terms of coming up with who the characters were, in some ways, great novels are timeless in terms of the characters and the struggles, because we still deal with the same question. What is time? What is love? Who do I marry? When do I run? When is it too dangerous for me? These are timeless questions. But then in terms of, okay, so you have a person asking these questions, but what is their job? What are they doing every day with their life? And so with Miri, I made her the surgeon for reasons I said. And then I wanted her to have a mentor. Somebody had to take her under their wing to teach her. Someone had to believe in her. And I thought that person would be someone that she loved very much. And that's how I came to her fiance. But while she loved him and he was a great man, I knew he also had to have a dark side. There was something that just didn't fit with what she wanted. And so that's how you sort of explore. And then you say, well, what could have been dark? What was happening, right? And I don't want to give too much away, but a lot of these things, when you research the moment, that moment in time, these sort of characters sort of pop out as, someone lost somebody in a pogrom, not just her grandmother. Somebody's parents were forced into a terrible situation because they were Jewish and they had to, listen and follow orders or they would die. And so these sorts of answers sort of come from that research.
Let's talk a little bit about Miri's grandmother. And one of the things I also really love is how multi-generational the story is, right? There's actually two sets of grandmothers and granddaughters. So how did you think about that kind of multi-generational piece of the story and about like the role that family plays in general in your writing?
Yeah. So, and people ask me a lot, are any of these characters real? And, did you put your real family in here? And I guess that's where what was real is this multi-generational love. I mean, I loved my great aunts. I was with them every single week and they were such a part of my life. And I can't imagine, writing a story without having that multi-generational voice, because you write what you know in terms of that's how I knew people grew up, right? That you have these multi-generations. And so that's really what I brought in from my own life. And actually in the history of time travel, also, I have 3 generations of women from the same family again, because I think that we grow with each other, but we also sometimes hold each other back or challenge each other. And I think that family, those roots are so strong that I love to highlight them and really bring them to the front.
We have some questions about the love triangle in the book, but I don't know how much we want to spoil for people who haven't read it. But do you want to talk a little bit about how you came to that kind of piece of the plot?
Yeah. So why did I use a love triangle, for example? So Miri we've talked about, she is a woman who's going to be breaking tradition, right? Breaking down barriers. She is as modern as a woman could be in 1914 Russia. And what does that mean? And so the love triangle is really an echo of her own inner struggle. Does she accept what she's supposed to do and what is set out for her and the path that she started on? Or does she break from that? And does she decide to go in a different direction? And that's another way to introduce modernity and, this idea of can a woman choose her path, but also a person, because I think a lot of us, myself included, it's very easy to stay on a path. It's very easy to just sort of go with the flow and not stand up and change what you're doing. But what if you dare to stand up? And what if you dare to turn around, right? And choose something different? And that's what is echoed in the love triangle. She's on one path, but she chooses to go another way. What's the right answer? Who knows? But to have that sort of that bravery, that courage, I think is amazing. And that's what I wanted to highlight.
And there was a question about whether you think her grandmother knew, as a matchmaker, had insight into that love triangle.
I know. I mean, what do grandmothers know? I feel like grandmothers know so much, right? So I can't imagine that Baba didn't have an inkling, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll leave it to you guys.
I was thinking about how this book is both, a totally universal story, right? Actually, like literally about the universe.
Yes.
And also a very Jewish story, right? We already talked about how you framed pieces of it in terms of the Jewish calendar. And it's obviously a story that's very much, it's about a Jewish family and about anti-Semitism and kind of the ways that was playing out in Russia in that period. So how are you, when you were writing the book, were you thinking about it as being something that was kind of written for, did you have kind of a Jewish audience in mind or a broader audience? And also what's the reader response been from different people?
Right. So I didn't actually think about who the audience was going to be, because I don't, maybe I should, right? Maybe better writers or better marketers that way. But I really think of what is the story that I want to tell. And Russia was so segregated, in particular in 1914. So Jews living in Russia were not Russians, right? We were Jews. You were not a Russian citizen. So, I mean, it would be very hard to have sort of an assimilated life. And so just by choosing main characters that are Jewish to put it in that world, right? That's where it lands. But also there's this amazing struggle at the time. I'm going to call it struggle. I don't know what you call it, but you're coming off of the sort of the Jewish Enlightenment and this idea of can we assimilate is the question. And I actually talk about this in the book. So you have for the first time Jews coming out of the pale, refusing to wear the black hats or, follow the rabbis and, observe the Sabbath or any of this, and, trying to become Russians. And it's a struggle today too. Do we assimilate? Do we intermarry? And these were, by many accounts, some of the first times that in larger scale in Russia, this was happening. And you also have, should we show the picture of the Sophie movement that was just starting then? Hold on, let me pull that up. So here it is. We have in Russia, share, here we go. This movement to, band together and teach Jewish youth how to defend themselves, how to go out to Turkey, Palestine, Israel, whatever you want to call that land now, that area, right? How to fight against the pogroms, how to stand up against anti-Semitism. And you have these youth movements starting for the first time. And this is actually a picture from one of the camps, according to one of the photo archives that I found, where they're teaching this youths to defend themselves, to camp, whatever. And one of my characters, Yuri, is a member of these. We see these in modern day Sophim, which still carry over in Israel.
Right, the scout movement.
The scout movement. Yeah, thank you. Is still there. So these are pretty inspirational, and I just knew I was just in awe, and I knew I had to include that. I had to have one of my characters be a member of this movement.
Right, and it's such an important representative of some people's solution to the Jewish question. This question of where do Jews belong and where do we fit, and that was one answer, and we're still playing those questions out in very similar kinds of ways.
Yeah, for sure.
If people have more questions, feel free to add them to the chat. I was thinking a lot about, as obviously this is the Quarantine Book Club, we're doing this program at a time when we're going through some really challenging times. And I often turn to history to look for lessons of resilience and to think about, sort of get some perspective on the challenges that humans have faced before and the ways that we've responded and what we can learn from people's response, both positive and negative. So, as you think about the context of the story that you wrote and its setting, are there lessons that you're that are resonating with you in this moment do you find yourself reflecting on that period of 1914 and thinking what we can try to learn from the challenges of those times that might help us navigate the challenging times that we're in now? Yeah.
So, I guess sadly, I think there's still the book opens with brother and sister Mary and Vanya sitting down with their grandmother and saying, "Is it time for us to run?" And they mean run in terms of get up, leave everything we know, everything we own, everyone we love, and leave this country and just run. And I cannot imagine, I feel very lucky that I cannot imagine having to make that decision. How bad it must have been, or it is now, for everybody, right, to stand up and say, it's time to run. And we see it happening all the time, every day in the news, when you look at borders clogged, right? Boats coming, boats drowning, or, detention centers. I mean, it is heartbreaking because there are still millions of people asking this question every day. And so while this book is set in 1914, the questions are very relevant. And I've been to a number of book talks at this point. I've been very lucky to be speaking around the country, and where people bring this up and they talk about, I hear their stories about, escaping, whether or not they're Jewish, when they decided to leave whatever country they came from, and their stories. And I feel so lucky that people are coming up to me and sharing these stories. And at the same time, it's just still, right? We're still dealing with this, still fighting with this. And so that part has continued to be relevant and continues to be a discussion. And I think for some people, it's easier to look back on this 1914 book and then to say, to talk about it in that context, because it's not as close. There's one step removed, and then they can come, it sort of opens the discussion topic, and then they come to me afterwards and share their stories. And I've heard some just heartbreaking, but also beautiful stories, because at the end of the day, I had one Holocaust survivor actually when I was in Israel. I was presenting, and he said, I left everything. I lost my entire family, but I am here tonight talking about a book, right? This is freedom. This is something I never would have imagined. All I wanted was my next meal, right? To know I wasn't going to die in the morning. And yet here he was at night talking about a book as a gift. And it was an amazing thing to hear.
It is one of the, I think it's one of the reasons why something like a book club in this time feels meaningful, because art both grounds us in, and we talked about this a little bit last week too, art grounds us in human experience and kind of gives us insight into that. And it also is something that, when we have the energy to turn to art, we know that on some level we are surviving, we're okay, we have the energy to do that. And so there's a certain comfort in that too, that I think that story really, really expresses. We have a whole bunch of questions. Some of them are about characters that you wrote. Did you have a favorite character that you identified with? Did you know, did the characters kind of take you on a journey? Did you know where you were going? Did you have a sense of where it was going to end up?
Yeah, so I always knew the ending. I always knew where it was going to end up, and I did not always know the twists and turns. And I think the thing that I struggled with the most in terms of character building, and I was most surprised with, were issues around Yuri, who is Miri's mentor and fiance. And my editor, Millicent, I don't know if she's out there. Hello, Millicent, if you're there. She kept saying to me, but Rachel, how does Yuri take his tea? How is he going to take his tea? And at first I was like, that's crazy. But then I realized what she was asking was, you need to know this character so well that you know how he's going to drink his tea. Is he going to mix jam? Is he going to mix vodka? Is he not even going to touch the tea and go, straight for something, I don't know, whatever, right? And so these sorts of questions were, in hindsight, some of the most helpful in terms of character building. And Yuri in particular, it was easy to make him a stereotype and to sort of make him an unlikable character. But then I realized, actually, I loved Yuri, and Miri loved Yuri. And how could I make, my readers also love Yuri? And so while I knew where the ending would go, I didn't know how to get Yuri into that and how to really give him his full place in the book. And that took many, many, many drafts. and I think in the end, I gave him some of the most moving passages in the book, at least for me. Yeah, that was part of it.
We have a question about sort of the fact that Jewish ritual and holiday observances and Torah are not an active presence in the book. Did you make that decision on purpose? Was that, tell us a little bit about that decision.
Yeah, so Miri and her family are assimilated Jews. They are that bridge. So while they may never sit down and eat ham, right, they will work on the Sabbath, on Shabbat. And they were part of that first generation. So Babushka was raised in a family that was religious observant, but Miri was not. And this was the first. And I talk about in the book how I said that Kovno itself was built with sort of different layers of the Jewish community, but they all came together for the matchmaker. But you had this tug between then and you have now, right? Between you must observe Shabbat, the Sabbath. No, I'm going to assimilate, right? And they sort of, where do they meet in the middle? Which side are they on? And it's a constant struggle, I think, in all religions, but in this book, in Judaism in particular.
You showed us a lot of amazing photos that helped you in your research. And Eileen wants to know whether you had a map from the time since you take your characters on this really quite dramatic journey, did you also have maps that helped you plot that out?
Yes, I did. Shoot, I should have thought about that and brought them. And also, train routes and where someone would go, and sort of what were the different junctions and all of that. And it was super fun to go through that. Tax farmers, the Polyakov story, all of that was real and or based in real life. And so I had all this kinds of research. So Russia in 1914 was this enormous empire. I mean, you can't even imagine how huge it was in today's world. But now you talk about Kovno, it's Kaunas, it's in a different country. Riga is a different country, right? So everything now is different from where it was. So of course, we also had the issue of, well, what do we call Kovno? Do we call it Kaunas? Do we call it Kovno? These are decisions. So we decided to go with all the 1914 names. But if you look at maps from them, they are very, very different from what a map would look like today in the region.
Marla has a great comment that brings us back to this question of the role of art today. She reminds us of the Audre Lorde essay, which is one of my very favorites, Poetry is Not a Luxury. And it's also a reminder that these issues are really current, that there still are really big questions around what gets funded and whether people see arts and other humanities as kind of, icing on the cake or essential. And certainly I think about this a lot as someone who runs a history organization and feels like the work that we do is not just like a nice thing to have, but something that's really core to understanding the world and understanding ourselves and understanding how change is made. So I think it's important to remember that too, that art brings us to like the most core of human experience and helps us imagine ourselves out of really challenging situations, which again, why it's, I certainly didn't mean to imply that books matter in times like this because they're a distraction, although they can also be a distraction. But a distraction in a way that feels really real, right? That feels like it touches core issues of who we are and how the world works and how we can make the world better. So I very much appreciate that. And I think especially when you're writing about a moment like 1914, where everything is about to change and where there's just such, sort of foment.
Yes.
There's so much of that comes up, and you've already touched on some of that. And you have this slide to show us some of the movements that were happening then, but you've touched on that even just in thinking about Miri. I mean, so much of it is contained in her experience, right? She's a Jew and she's a doctor and she's a woman who's a doctor and she's had to get an education and she's trying to figure out what that means in terms of her family life and who she can be.
Yeah. I mean, I think art is essential to life, right? And is undervalued, sadly. But I think also thinking about the context and the ideas, and it is reflected in art. And I love this slide because 1914, I call it the explosion of ideas, right? And look at these artists, look at these people who were looming in 1914 and all those ideas that were cramming down and sadly, horrifically, right, ended with World War I. But I mean, the ideas, the art, that moment, I think, is also here today. We see it, and I cannot wait to see what art and books are going to be coming out of the current moment. And I see I've read a lot of writers saying, give it a year before you try to write this, but I think there's going to be some amazing stuff coming out of this moment. This, and Emily St. John Mandel wrote Station 11. And that was she said it with a pandemic, and the world's falling apart. There are lots of books like that, but I hear that referred to a lot of, what is the future going to look like? How could an artist capture this so perfectly who hasn't lived through it? And I just love artists and writers.
Yeah.
For that.
We have had a couple questions about your second book, the book you're working on now, and both what it's about and also sort of how the process compares having finished one book and starting another one.
Yeah. So let's see. The next book is called, it's called The History of Time Travel tentatively, although I heard from my editor that we will be changing the title. So I'm not sure what it will be called, but it's supposed to come out in about a year and a half or so. And it was different in that I continued with the theme of what is time. And this idea, Einstein worked on time dilation and, on the event horizon of a black hole, time is experienced differently. You could stand there in front of a black hole. You might think that 10 minutes passed, but on Earth, it would have been 100 years. I'm sort of fascinated with that idea. And could I use that for time travel? But that is sort of the setting, just as the race to prove relativity is the setting in Bend in the Stars. And the true story is the relationships, the love, the family, the 3 generations of women. So I have 3 generations, and each of them builds a piece of the time machine that they use to save the family, and ultimately stop Chernobyl from happening. So that's what the book is about. The experience has been pretty different in that I know what's coming. Right. So the first time I sold Bend in the Stars with a different title. And when they told me that title doesn't work, it was sort of like, oh, this crushing blow. I love
what was the old title?
It's called The Matchmaker's Manifesto. And then I called it. Yeah, thank you. I liked it too, but it didn't fit. And, it was hard to accept at first. But this time they told me, I was like, yeah, I was waiting for that. So, and I know the process of how we'll go through coming up with a title again. So these sorts of things, I think because I know what to expect, it's a lot more streamlined in that sense.
So what are the historical periods that your characters in the new novel live in?
So it starts off with the Russian Revolution in 1917. And we have the great-grandmother marching in one of the women's marches. And then we have on International Women's Day, and then sort of runs through World War II. It's sort of like a big conglomeration of events because I go through 3 generations. So World War II, escaping from Hitler, escaping into the Soviet Union in order to build the bomb, the race with America. And then using that research then to channel it into building the RBMK reactors that become Chernobyl, and then the Chernobyl meltdown, and then the invention of the time machine. And how far do you go back? And the biggest question, the overriding question in this book is, just because you can, does it mean you should? There are lots of things we can do. Should we do them? Mm-hmm. And I think especially when we look at modern weapons, modern decisions, right? We could destroy the world how many times over? Why do we keep building them? What are we doing with all of these weapons? Why are we arming ourselves this way? Why are we spending our money the way we do, the national budget? So these are the sorts of questions that I'm taking on. Just little questions.
Just little questions, right? Relativity, all of our global priorities.
Yes.
Good things to be contemplating in these moments when we're trapped at home with our children and imagining the world that we're all going to be stepping into.
Yes.
But thank you so much for sharing your book with us and sharing your process with us tonight and letting us be in conversation with you.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been amazing. I'm a huge fan of you guys, and I just so appreciate all of you who have taken your time tonight and listened. So thank you.
Well, it's been a great conversation, and I'm also just really grateful for the opportunity to create community together. It's been really meaningful to be able to have this experience with all of you. We are going to. I'm going to ask Mickey to put a link to our survey into the chat box, and we'll also send that out after. But we'd love for you to take the survey just to give us feedback about the Quarantine Book Club, because we're going to continue it and we want to make it as all the things you want it to be. This was the second in our series of virtual book club meetings, and the next one will be next week, next Thursday night, April 2nd at 8 p.m. Eastern Time with Esther Safran Foer talking about her new memoir, I Want You to Know We're Still Here. So I hope that all of you will join us for that event as well. And stay tuned for more meetings because we've got more in the works because we don't want this to end.
Yes.
As I've said, the authors that we're featuring in the Quarantine Book Club are now or have been in the past years part of JWA's online book club. And you can find more information about our book club, our book picks for this year, and other original content from our authors at jwa.org/book club and also at Goodreads. And so I hope you'll check it out, and I hope you'll check out JWA's resources and stories and story collecting tools and our podcast, which just started a new season called Can We Talk? is the name of our podcast. We have so many more resources to keep you engaged and learning and seeing the world differently and hearing women's voices in a new way and understanding the Jewish story in a new and deeper way. So I hope that you'll check out our site, check out our podcast, sign up on our site to receive more updates from JWA so you know when we're doing other programs like this. Lex, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all those places too to find out more information.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel Barenbaum. This was an amazing session, and I have made my background a bend in the stars. And this link, I'm trying. Today's a background day. We're gonna have some fun with these shout outs at the end. But so this link up here, bit.ly/QBC Barenbaum, that will take you to a link where you can purchase this book. Strong encouragement to do so.
Thank you.
And also, ready for this, folks? Judith mentioned that we have next week coming up with Esther Safran 4, and I'm going to encourage people who want to check it out beforehand. Now, this is an exciting occasion because the book actually only comes out a couple days before we are meeting, but we're meeting. So this will be one of the first book talks, and you can pre-order at this link.
Wow, very impressive.
ly/QBC week 3, because that is our third quarantine book club. So,
and it's also a really engrossing read. I read the whole thing in one day while I was waiting
you got an
during a
advanced
hockey
copy.
Tournament. Yes, I'm important. I get the advanced copy. So I just couldn't put it down. Read the whole thing in a day while I was trapped at a hockey tournament with my son, and it's really gripping and beautiful.
Awesome. I'm very much looking forward. And so now we get to the shameless background, which is, of course, JewishLIVE. We are so thrilled to be featuring some incredible live streamed events like this one on JewishLIVE.org. Thanks to all of you who've been streaming there, in addition to on YouTube, on Facebook, in this Zoom room. And we have our JewishLIVE Facebook group. That's all one word, JewishLIVE. And if you join there, you'll be able to follow all the newest updates on what is happening in this digital Jewish ecosystem of ours, which is rapidly growing day by day. So thank you all so much for joining us. Judith, anything else to close us out?
Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for helping us build this community. And we're just really grateful to be able to be in these conversations and to think about how we make meaning in these challenging times and draw on the depth of the resources that we have at our disposal. And we have many as people who are inheriting this rich history. Mickey has put a link to the survey in the chat box, so feel free to click on that and fill that out. And we hope to see you next Thursday for our conversation with Esther 4. Thank you so much, and stay safe and be well, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Good night. Okay, I have saved the chat.
Oh, nice. And you can press the stop live stream.